My name is Michael Davidson with the University of California, San Diego, and my memo is on the topic of evaluating national security imperatives of critical minerals and technologies for the low carbon energy transition. We all know that the low carbon energy transition is going to require the deployment of large amounts of new technologies, including renewables, battery storage, EVs, as well as hydrogen-based processes. These technologies have two fundamental differences from the fossil systems that they're going to replace. One is an increased reliance on upfront capital investments in technologies and an increase in the diversity and quantity of minerals required to produce those technologies, including those with relatively limited production to date. Furthermore, the production of those minerals have different geographic concentration, as well as the processing of those minerals have different production chains from fossil systems, and in general are more highly concentrated and in different locations, thus altering the geopolitics of the new energy systems. So in my memo, I briefly review the various minerals that are required for EVs, EV batteries, grid storage batteries, renewable energy technologies, including solar and wind, as well as hydrogen-based processes, such as electrolyzers and fuel cells. Each of these has different sets of mineral requirements. Some of them, the clean energy technologies, have a dominant share of the minerals demand currently and are projected to increase. Others, the clean energy demands are a fraction of the total demand, and though while increasing, we would still expect them to be a minority demander of these minerals going into the future. Increasingly, we also see the minerals component, the upstream critical minerals components into these renewable technologies and clean energy technologies are shaping their technological development. That is, for example, for the case of cobalt, where extraction is taking place largely in one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that has both geopolitical risks as well as human rights concerns and is prompting shift to cobalt-free chemistries. Thus, we see this interaction between the minerals availability and the future clean energy technology pathways. And conversely, those clean energy technology pathways will also be shaping critical minerals markets. So, for example, lithium, for which EV batteries and grid storage batteries are the dominant player in this market, we saw huge spikes in lithium prices as a result of clean energy packages that were passed last year. So we would expect to see a closer coupling between these volatile minerals markets and the clean energy pathways and technologies chosen along those. So how does the national security current concerns play into this? We'll identify three main imperatives for national security that relate to the clean energy transition. First is maintaining energy security. And historically, this was based on fossil fuels, which have, as sort of a broad definition, the ability to provide uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. Clean energy, of course, changes this fundamentally because there is no or very limited requirement for ongoing recurring minerals inputs to maintain energy generators once they're installed, or storage or other clean energy technologies, and thus mitigating many energy security concerns. Nevertheless, there are calls to broaden the definition of energy security to reflect different components other than this historical emphasis on recurring fuels inputs. And so I should discuss some different definitions in the power grid, where reliability may come into play and how these are affected by the clean energy transition. The second main national security imperative relates to dual use, technological edge. And this is where technologies that were developed in the civilian arena are also applied to military contexts. And maintaining technological edge means enhancing one's own military capabilities while preventing access to those technologies by adversaries. And dual-use technologies can be subject to a variety of policy controls, including export controls on domestic firms, investment restrictions by foreign firms, as well as subsidies or domestic sourcing requirements for domestic supply chains. And while we see very limited evidence of export control being important in the renewable energy context, The ensuring access to critical minerals has prompted significant discussion around investments in upstream mining. And we do see some evidence of this in requirements of where sourcing of battery minerals in order to qualify for the EV subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act, though these are not specifically tied to military uses. And there seems to be limited public data on the extent of battery needs and critical mineral needs across the US military, though it's likely a small fraction of the total demand in the US economy. Side note to this is that the clean energy transition will, in general, have a net positive impact on military capabilities by reducing vulnerable fossil fuel supply lines. So there is an inherent imperative within the national security context to accelerate the low carbon energy transition and to reduce the use of fossil fuels in forward operating contexts. And then thirdly, the national security imperative of protecting critical infrastructures, which can have systemic impacts across the economy, such as the power grid. We do see a number of studies and a lot more policy emphasis on protecting critical infrastructures from outside hacks, from backdoors, as well as from physical damage to that critical infrastructure. While in contrast to the clean energy technologies, where once they're built, they tend to have limited security impacts, or the failure of particular renewable energy components will likely not generate systemic impact. When we move to the transmission grid, this is not the case. There are more critical features within that infrastructure, and thus that could generate some sources of vulnerability, which might influence how the various utilities might want to source those components moving into the future. And I briefly discussed supply chain security and how it's not really its own security definition, but really should be seen clearly as being with reference to some other security objective, and a low carbon energy transition that really relates to the first three imperatives. And so how do we evaluate the geopolitical risk? Well, clearly across the board, the main concern around these risks is the high concentration of China in the upstream processing of critical minerals, as well as the extraction in the case of some of those minerals. And so in contrast to China's position in fossil fuel markets, where it's a net importer, it is a net exporter across almost all clean energy technologies and many of the processed minerals necessary for the clean energy transition. In a prior study that we published last year, we assessed the national security and economic risks from these various, from 5 key clean energy technologies: solar, wind, batteries, green steel, and carbon capture and sequestration. And generally, we assess the national security risks as being low across these various dimensions. Thus, there are some exceptions that I highlight in the memo. How this relates to the minerals discussion is therefore, while assessing where the minerals end up, that is the downstream applications, we see relatively low geopolitical risks associated with them. The risks where critical minerals and the clean energy technology that they support may differ is on the upstream side. That is where those clean energy technologies are used for national security purposes, of course, but also more importantly, where the critical minerals are shared with different downstream national security applications. And so I conclude with some policy recommendations, 3 in particular. One is to strengthen the supportive roles of defense departments in the clean energy transition to further new technology development and continue cost declines, which, as mentioned, would have a positive impact on forward operating capabilities and other improvements to national security infrastructure. Second is the need for developing country and risk-specific threat assessments for individual low-carbon transition minerals. As mentioned, the markets for these minerals are highly heterogeneous. They depend on technology pathways, which have their own sets of uncertainties. And then there are additional country-specific criteria and risk-specific criteria, whether they be geopolitical, natural, or technological uncertainties that can affect the particular threat assessments and the importance of maintaining some amount of transition minerals segmented away from current supply chains. And in this, it's generally important to adopt what has been called the small yard high fence strategy of screening technologies, similar to minerals, where the key applications where there are national security needs could be guided by securing diversified or domestic access to those capacity. And then finally, the third recommendation is to promote open mineral supply chains to facilitate the low-cost technology adoption. That is to say, the current very low cost of low carbon technologies is primarily driven by relatively unfettered global flows of capital, talent, and technology. And policy recourses in what are deemed high-risk areas should carefully weigh the benefits of those versus maintaining an open environment. And so for this, as we've seen with prior experiences with global fossil fuel supply and analyses of them, energy security is more enhanced by interconnected global supply chains. And by contrast, an overly strong emphasis on mineral independence may lead to less redundancy in the ability to withstand shocks, whether they're natural or geopolitical.